Thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really excited for today's session. We have some really amazing speakers lined up, and I think it's going to be great. So I will quickly go through a couple slides. I know you're not here to hear me speak, so I will be quick. Jenna, if you can go to the next slide, please. So this is just an overview again of all of the sessions. Today we are on session 2. We'll be talking about household level interventions from crisis prevention to stable housing. Next slide, please. And this is again just an overview, sort of as a timeline to show you where we're at. So today is February 25th. We are on the second session. Our next one will be in March, and that will focus on sort of community level interventions. I did want to let all of the funders know the RFP has been released. We're getting a lot of interest. Last week we held a question and answer session for any organizations who were interested in applying and had questions. We had a good turnout. There were about I want to say 15 to 20 folks on the call, and I checked in today. We've already had one application submitted, and there are about 5 in draft, and I expect we'll get quite a few more. So I think we're going to have a good pool to choose from. And I think we have one more slide. Jenna, if you would please. Great. So this is today's speakers. So first we're going to hear from Larry Seamans, the president and CEO of FamilyAid. And then we'll hear from Danielle Ferrier, the CEO of Heading Home. And I see your question, Bill. We will, after we hear from the presenters, they'll each present for a little bit. We'll have time for question and answer. Then we'll have a bit of a panel discussion. And then probably around 1 or so, they'll head off and we'll keep it just the funders. And then we can dig in a little bit into the RFP. So please hold that question and any others that you might have. So at this point, I am going to stop talking and turn it over to Larry Seamans.
Great. Well, thank you. Again, I know Rachel told you a little bit about FamilyAid, and I know we're picking up a thread. I know you met with our friend Luke from the Boston Foundation and Indicators Project. So I'm going to pick up the thread today for you to really talk about our experience as a 110-year-old organization, a little bit about some solutions. I know there are many of them, but there are some that we've proven to work for families in particular, which is a kind of very different population than some other homeless populations. So to start, I actually want to talk a little bit with you about family life. These are all mothers in our program currently. And I want you to kind of, if you could, to just frame the whole conversation for both Danielle and myself is think about kind of what family life is for you or has been, if you've been parents or even children at some point or friends or colleagues, right? A couple things. The challenge right now to find a doctor. I don't know about you, but I'm waiting a couple months now to get my checkup. Can you imagine that same thing is happening for pediatrics? Maybe you've had the experience of having to be concerned about having to pick up your child after work before the daycare closes, right? Or maybe it's a matter of your child gets ill and you have to explain to your employer that you can't come to work today because you have no one to watch your child when they're sick, right? All those things that those of us who have been parents have experienced. Now I want to take that thought process and add to that some other things that some of us may or may not have experienced in our lives. The fact that maybe your income is only about $11,000 a year, that you are unemployed, or that you might be escaping domestic violence. Things that have dynamics relative to the family. And I think that's the storm of family homelessness, right? It is a combination of things. Homelessness, in this case, for all of our families, and I think Danielle would agree, is really not about homelessness as the issue. It's really a symptom of a larger issue. So I have here kind of a formula that we use at FamilyAid that kind of frames our work, which is what Rachel asked us to speak about today. So family homelessness is actually a nexus of a lot of other issues happening all at once. And you can see kind of these are rankings for the metropolitan Boston area. Child poverty is the starter, right? It's a formula. We have the 5th highest level of child poverty in the country. 1 out of 4 children are living in poverty in the greater Boston area. You add to that the 5th highest cost of living, housing costs, child care costs, the highest in the country, $25,000 a year. What we call Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We are anticipating $1.9 billion in services for low-income families to be removed over the course of the next 18 months based on the federal government. And then the most important thing is the breaks in social determinants of health. So what keeps families together, research has shown this, are these six things. When families can fully utilize and leverage every resource, community, personal, within municipal or federal government's resources, they can keep themselves safe in poverty. But when there's a break in one of those things, what happens is we have family homelessness, which in the Commonwealth is fourth of all states in America, according to a most recent HUD survey that came out last year. And Boston in particular is ranked fifth. And the metropolitan area around Boston, what we call the balance of state, is number one for all suburban areas in America. That's the nexus of all these issues coming to play at once. What we've learned in our time is that housing alone isn't enough, and we cannot build housing fast enough. You saw in your last report, as I understand it, Luke shared data that he shared with the rest of us, how many housing units are being produced? 50,000, right? But less than 10% of those are designed to be affordable, and less than 2% of those are designed for people with incomes at extremely low incomes, right? That's just how housing gets developed. So we cannot build ourselves out of this. The second thing we know as you look at the slide is that this complexity for family means that agencies, any of us, individually, collectively, state organizations, individual agencies cannot solve this issue alone. It is too big and too complex. So for a nexus issue, FamilyAid has worked over the last 30 years or 110-year history on a nexus theory of change. The first is the best way to end homelessness is to prevent it from happening in the first place. If there's no housing to be had, then we have to keep families where they are if it's safe. And if families can't stay there because they're being evicted or other things, then we have to reduce the harm of that as families enter into shelter and other types of housing, especially for the children. And so for our goal is really wraparound supports that go with all of our expert housing placement work for both children and parents. How that plays out at FamilyAid right now, in the course of a year, we're working with about 5,200 children and parents. That number we're estimating now is going to go up to about 6,000. I'll show you some data in a second. These are the six areas where FamilyAid really brings kind of nexus solutions to the complex issues that our families have. At the bottom, you can see some of our work with our families. Those are all staff people working with some of our kids. The first you see at the bottom is coordinated systems. We've been part of a large 4-year FamilyAid facilitated a 4-year process with Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and the Aspen Institute to look at how systems for kids experiencing homelessness can be improved upon. That work's coming to close. I know you're going to talk about systems later, but if you're interested as part of that, there's a web address. You can go look and see the work. There are reports that have been produced over the last 4 years by 200 organizations that are working to really improve systems, and Family had the honor of supporting that and facilitating it for Aspen. As you go up, you'll see there's also rapid rehousing. FamilyAid has the largest contract in the city of Boston for rapid rehousing and transitional housing programs. I think, Danielle, I think you might be covering that in your conversation and can tell you more about the details on that type of programming. But where I really want to focus today in the short period of time I have with you is this concept of helping families navigate while we're working on housing placement, because we have a great housing placement team, working to make sure that housing alone won't solve the parents' issue. They're still worried about their kids. They're still trying to find doctors. They're still trying to find food. So what we do is we place people in housing or keep them in their housing or keep them in shelter to move to housing while we're providing this kind of 2-generational navigation and support on those 6 domains that I showed you previously. So we have master's level experts who are actually building relationships for our families that are in our care. We have 36 priority partnerships in each of those, across those 6 domains, so about 6 in each, where services and resources are prioritized for our families. That's really the big difference for FamilyAid, right? Bringing everyone collectively together to help children and parents. The second key program is a private eviction program. The government believes that funding should not be used kind of in a crisis. So what you'll see across the government landscape is money for something called supportive housing, money for shelter, and something called diversion. Diversion is when someone shows up at the door, they've already been evicted, and they're looking for an answer. For a lot of families, that means they're already kicked out of their housing, and that's a little too late. So through private support, FamilyAid had worked together with the Boston Public Schools because every public school is required by law to ask if a family is doing okay in their housing. And when they're saying, I'm struggling, the BPS, we have a technical system. We immediately get a notice from the BPS. We have 3,800 children and parents in the program right now. They actually contact us. We then talk with the family and begin to work on keeping them in their housing if it's safe. And that's a lot of key work where we apply our two generational supports as well to kind of again talk with landlords, do mediation on any particular issue. We have a partnership with the Greater Boston Legal Services with a BPS. It's a three-way partnership where in the event that the family falls through that safety net and they're heading towards eviction, then we're working with the Greater Boston Legal Services to provide free legal counsel that's being funded by the City of Boston. So again, kind of a larger view because we believe that that prevention work is actually going to create less trauma for children and give them a better opportunity in the long run and keep families in housing because new housing doesn't necessarily exist. How we manage this and how we check to make sure families are accessing each of those 6 domains resources is something that we developed with the support of Apt Associates out of Cambridge. They have something called the Arizona Self-Sufficiency Matrix for the experts in the room. It's a behavioral health screening tool that talks about utilization of resources. We have an applied version of that. You can see below how that's done, where we're tracking families' access, enrollment, utilization, and consistency in using those resources to pull themselves out of poverty with our support and coaching. So you can see below, for example, that's a food assessment that was done on somebody, I guess, yesterday, where you can see where we ask certain questions, and then if the question says yes or no, they're not accessing it, what to do next. So then we have a standard operating procedure of how to access a resource or one of our navigators to ensure families are getting food. On the right-hand side, you can see where our families are currently as of today. We track every single one of our families, and the bulk of them are in green. So that's they're further along in their self-sufficiency. And we have a large group of people coming through our prevention programs because the shelter doors are closed, families are doubled up, and so they're kind of in this what we call force phase 1 because we never want to give anyone zero. They're in crisis. So that's our kind of crisis group. Is almost 400 children and parents right now who are in this kind of very high crisis level, and the rest are kind of somewhere in between as we work towards self-sufficiency. And as families hit that 4 mark, meaning that they're accessing and utilizing all these resources, the value of all those resources are enough to live confidently and comfortably enough, then they're disenrolled from our programs with their consent and our consent. So that's how we do the work. Here's a daily tracking progress sheet. This is pulled off last night. This sits on all of our computers, and we track and monitor how well our families are doing in each of those domains. You can click on a button and actually get down to the client so that everyone is working again to everyone's self-sufficiency. And you can see it's taking us right about now about 2.57 quarters. So just almost 7 months for us to get someone from being in crisis, that red mark, over into the green. So we're tracking and evaluating at an individual case level and at a macro level. So here's a larger view. Again, this is how the agency does our work. We're tracking on those 4 key outcomes, self-sufficiency being the first one, housing stability, that's our prevention program. 97% of our families as of now are still stably housed in their own housing with all these supports that we're putting in. Housing placements, again, this is Danielle and FamilyAid have the same heading home. We both do housing placements and then retention of that housing. And then you can see we're already at 3,200 children and parents, and we still have a long time period of 2026. So we're expecting those numbers to be reaching the 6,000 mark. So that's kind of how we look at our work. Just to give you an external view, FamilyAid's really delighted that our work has been identified by the Aspen Institute. We're part of something called the Ascend Network. It's 500 agencies that are kind of creating these types of innovations around poverty. And we're one of 15 that have been identified for accelerating kind of progress on kind of self-sufficiency. We're delighted to be a top places to work and something to invite you all to. Our prevention program in particular, the William T. Grant Foundation, some of you may know of them, the Doris Duke Foundation and the Spencer Foundation funded Boston College and the United Way to actually do a 6-year longitudinal study on our prevention programs. So the researchers out of BC and BU are going to be presenting the research on it that shows that families in our prevention programs, the kids have better academics, the parents have longer term housing stability, and that both well-being for the child and parent are higher. So they're going to announce all this in a day-long session on April 10th at BC to kind of reveal that and talk about other programs around the Commonwealth.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to hand it over to Danielle's team from Heading Home. And just as a reminder too, after she presents, we'll have time for a bit of a panel discussion. So you'll get plenty of more opportunities to hear from Larry.
All right. It's great to see everybody. Thanks for having us. To Larry's point, I am a social worker. I'm a trained trauma therapist. My first close to 20 years in work was in child welfare mental health. And so that is a lens that overlays for our agency, although like all agencies, we all do it a little bit differently with overlaps in the work. So Heading Home is a 51-year-old agency. We are around 50 million, and we work here. I'm going to talk about the work we do that's really from prevention all the way into what will be moving into a new affordable housing category. Our mission is to prevent end homelessness, that we unequivocally share with Larry and his crew, right? Through personalized support and shelter, as well as we do a lot of advocacy and affordable housing work to provide stability and foster independence. So 50 years. In those 50 years, last year we went back and tallied over 50,000 people have been served. And I say 50,000 people because in our agency, actually, when I came in close to 9 years ago now, we had a strategic question that we asked ourselves as an agency, which was, did we focus on only individuals or families, which is a frequent way that our system has traditionally divided itself. And there's a handful of us that do not do it that way. So we serve folks birth to elders, with about 70% of our work being on the family side and 30% on the adult side. Next slide, please. In the last almost 9 years, we have actually expanded pretty dramatically based on need. I always say, unfortunately, that the case should be we're going out of business. That's the goal of a nonprofit. But when there isn't a need, our goal is to kind of step in. And we have done that. As you see now, we're up and down the kind of East Coast of Massachusetts. And with this year, we started serving and supporting a nonprofit in North Central. So really just trying to make sure, to Larry's point, we have strong systems, strong nonprofits to do the work we're doing. In the past year, we served over 8,100 people, of which 50% were children, 3,100 households, prevented homelessness for over 1,000 families. So our prevention work, Larry mentioned there is a diversion program that the state runs. We also do private money. So that's a combo for us of state and private dollars that work with families to stay out of homelessness first, and then support them, obviously, if that doesn't work. Last year, we moved 500 families out of shelter and into permanent housing, and our retention rates for over 20 years have run over 90%. Last year, 95%, where folks are stably housed, minimum 12 months post-placement. We have a lot of programs. I look at things, as Larry talked about, like systems, right? And so I think about systems in kind of both length of the system, right, front to back, and then width, right? How do we think about preventing all the way to affordable housing, as well as what we call the wraparound services that families need in order to support their transitions, their stability, decreasing trauma, helping them stay housed, all of those things. So we run diversion, we run emergency shelter, we do a lot of permanent supportive housing. That is for folks who have been homeless for over 12 months and who have a disability as defined by federal ADA definition. We do affordable housing. So we are moving into fair market affordable housing in what we call 50 to 60% AMI. That is our frontline workers, right? That's our teachers, our nurses, our firefighters, our police officers who are making 50 to 120,000. And that's a place we believe when we create a spectrum in kind of a ladder that both helps people get out, but also prevents people from coming in. Wraparound supports, evidence-based case management. So our case management is an EBT model that uses trauma-informed care and motivational interviewing. Stabilization services. Larry talked about, right? We all, as providers in shelter, have to work with folks and make sure that they stay out of shelter, right? When we get them into housing, how do we make sure they don't actually end up coming back, right? How are we helping support them out in their communities? And we do that now for 2 to 3 years at minimum, and just making sure that they have access to whether it's financial literacy, employment, parenting, disability support services, community integration. And so that's work that we all kind of share in the portfolio of shelter, critical for post-placement. Clinical support. Our team, additionally, because I'm a clinician by training, by trade, by the way I think, one of the things that we added a few years back was making sure that we had a triage capacity. So when Larry talked about, if you think about how long it takes a family to get to a primary care, I can tell you it's longer to get to a therapist. There are not enough therapists. The model there structurally is hard for folks to kind of make a living. So a lot of folks do it as a second job, or they don't do it full time. So we really have a lack of access to therapists as needed. And so folks are often waiting 3 to 6 months for therapists at this point. And so one of the things that we felt we needed in here was emergency clinical capacity that wasn't just the CEO, because obviously I have lots of hats that I wear. And so I couldn't always be our clinician on call. But we built in that capacity to make sure we really can support clients in need of triage support and helps kind of bridge and scaffold until we could get them into longer term therapy. We are actually developing a really cool tool that's a needs assessment when folks are coming in that can be implemented by frontline staff. So folks who don't have clinical training, we have a clinical tool that's being developed with the University of Chicago and has been used for a long time. It's called CANS. Many of us have seen it in other forms, but we're building one specifically for family shelter and families coming in. We do a lot of work in career and financial services because 50% of our families, at least in our agency, often don't have a high school diploma or equivalent. And that obviously can be a barrier at times for affordable wages for our folks who can work. I do say folks who can work because a lot of the folks who come to us also have disabilities, right? So we also have a group of folks where we have a policy gap who ideally we would be serving in a different way, and they wouldn't come to shelter because they have disability and can't work, or have a child with disability and can't work. We have been piloting for the last few years a program in that area that looks at credentialing that doesn't require a high school diploma, not because I don't support education without question, but what I don't support is barriers where you have to do step 1, 2, 3, 4. That's going to take folks multiple years. So things like CDLs, trades, there's a bunch of kind of areas where folks can partner with us and we can help with certification in order to get them a job that has kind of a more affordable living wage that comes with it. Community and state partners, like all of us, we only do this well if we're working with all of our colleagues. And so we have a lot of support in our communities and state, and actually we work federally as well. We have federal contracts that support some of our housing. All right, next slide. So one of the things we thought we'd take a second is kind of who are our families? And if this is redundant, I apologize for folks, but often we talk about folks in shelter. We talk about folks who are homeless, right? We have visuals that have been created by media over time. Often folks kind of go to the individual homeless person, often a male who's out on the street that you might see visibly, right? I think the family visual is a bit harder for folks, right? It's families in cars, it's families in ER rooms, right? It's families sometimes on occasion under bridges that people don't hear about. And so what does it look like for our families when they come in? There are a couple big bucket profiles, and this doesn't cover everybody, but I will talk about some of the data we see here because they are policy gaps that we're working to kind of fill. So I talked about 50% of our families often don't have high school diplomas, right, or equivalent. That matters, right? We know that matters for work, that matters for wages, right? The other close to 50% for our agency, it's 42% of our families come to us and they're single parents, mostly single moms, with children most often who have a disability. Sometimes a parent does, sometimes a child does, sometimes both do. We see high percentages of autism. So that is a large group of the profile that we are seeing in our programs. And what we say to the state is like, if we have a single parent with a kid with disability, what the data also tells us is families with kids with disabilities have higher divorce rates. So when you've had a family who was a married two-parent family, right, higher divorce rates exist because the stress of having kids with disability does increase, right? So you see those things, right? And they start to kind of play out and we see them then in the system. And so often we're trying to work with a family and the state to figure out what are the various options, right? If it's a family who the issue is education, for example, we're going to work to try to help figure out the credentialing, right? We pay for that. We make that happen. That's part of our programming. But when it comes to kids with families with disabilities, that's a little bit of a harder one, right? Because we don't particularly have an exact policy that addresses this. So then it's working with what the options are, what the kids kind of have access to, what the parents have access to, and how do we help them? You know, we can move them out. We can use the services called home base that I'm sure you guys have read about in the newspaper. As that money has increased, try to help families move out. But that's not going to be the long-term fix in that type of profile, right? Because that's a family who, if we got a parent who's a caretaker, there are actually some other states that pay caretakers, both for children with disability and aging parents. So those are the types of things that we look at to try to move the needle on better policy. And so typically on average, what I'd say is in terms of getting folks out of shelter, there's actually some regional differences. If we look outside of Boston, what we see is we're getting families out around 9 months. That's the average. I know Larry's thinking that's what length of stay says right now because there's new policies about how long families can stay. We're working, right? All of us are working on that too. But the average is typically about 9 months outside of Boston. When you come into Boston, what many of us see is more of a 12 to 15 month range, right? The rents are definitely higher, right? We all know that. There's less units available, right? So you're kind of competing differently. And so what we've talked about through all the policy shifts is how did we think about Boston as an outlier, right? But let's make sure the policy works for the families and for us to try to support the families. So you do see some regional differences. Obviously, the further out we move, right, the quicker we're able to get folks out of shelter. There are just more unit options at a more affordable rate. All of that is relative, right? If you saw the data, that we looked at earlier, we know our housing costs are high, our childcare, we are one of the more expensive states. We actually are also one of the states with the biggest discrepancy between wealth and poverty. So what does it look like for long-term stability and diversion? Some of it's case to case, right? We have buckets that I talked about, different clinical profiles of families and how we support them, the kind of prevention on the front end, the support on the back end. When rental assistance ends, what happens whether the family stays housed or not? Some of it depends on which bucket they fall in, right? Some of our families have been able to get jobs and they've not had to return. Other groupings we're seeing coming back into shelter, right? Because really the policy solution didn't fix the core problem, right? And so I think we know that, we identify it, we try to flag it for the state, right? I think, we push on them to say, like, this is not working for certain cohorts, right? Let's think about what would be a better way to do it. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. And for families that we can intervene earlier, I think some we can keep out and some we can't, right? It just depends on what the areas are. What I say is shelter, and I say this having come from the world of health and human services, shelter is really the system when all of the other systems have failed. That's where we see families and even adults come, right? When every other system we've had, mental health, disability, child welfare, right, hasn't worked to keep folks out of the system, then they come to us. And we're kind of, I consider it almost like the system of last resort, right? When everything else hasn't worked to keep them out, that we're here. One of the buckets that we talk about frequently in the state is, and this is a little bit outside of the direct work we are doing with the state, heading home at times does develop. Sometimes, but we're forced to because we own a property and we've decided to keep the property. Our board has said we don't want to lose all of our property. And so let's rebuild it. Let's, convert it. And so we've done that a few times. I would tell you it's easier to be a trauma therapist than to build, at least in the city of Boston, potentially in all of Massachusetts. And most recently in the last year, we opened up a 20-unit building of family permanent supportive housing in Boston. It took us 7 years to build it. So because I come out of child welfare, I'm impatient. I'm never going to build things for 7 years again. The other thing for me is when you add subsidies from city, state, and government, it increases costs and slows you down. So I'm never going to do that again either. Our board is well aware, as our CEO, while I'm here, we will not build that way again. But we have spent the last year looking at, did nonprofits, I believe we do. What is a role nonprofits should be playing in affordable housing in the 50 to 60% AMI category, right? So the folks that are really our working class folks, right? Our blue collar workers, our teachers, right? Firefighters. And we've developed, and our pro forma works. So I'm gonna say that first. That's the MBA side of my training. We have developed a pro forma that works with no subsidy for us to build affordable housing through modular development. We actually have our modular developer picked. They're out of Worcester. And we are going to put our first demonstration project out and build it in the next 6 months. We're narrowing down land right now. And when we do that, what we have without subsidy from city, state, or feds in the way that are looking at the financing is that we actually can build modular cheaper. We don't need the same returns that for-profit developers, who are most of my board members, need. And so it lets us really look at this differently. And we're going to look to build in this category. We'll look for smaller development structures, 20 to 40 units. We're not looking to build enormous 1,000-unit buildings, but we really think we might have found a sweet spot where we can start to add some housing that really gets to a core problem that can be a driver into our shelters. And so that's what we have coming up in the next year, in addition to all of the other things that we normally do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle. So yeah, I would like to open up the floor now if folks have questions for either Danielle or Larry. Yeah, Jonathan, please.
I have two questions. I mean, that was helpful and fascinating. The thing that was most fascinating was the thing you said at the very end. I've spent my career in the deeply subsidized affordable housing business. So the idea that you can build housing with a pro forma without any of those subsidies would be extraordinary, right? So
Mhm.
I'd love to learn more about that, either online or offline. I'm really curious about how the numbers work for that.
Yep.
That's kind of a extraordinary proposition. The other question I have for both you and Larry is there was a lot of hoopla, 3 or 4 weeks ago about the HUD, the change in the HUD regulations around housing first. And I'm
Yep.
curious if either of you have comments about that and how that is going to impact the hard work that you and so many others are all doing. So
Yeah. Larry, you want me to take the HUD?
You can
I can
start,
take the
sure.
modular too. And Jonathan, obviously the modular is ours, and I'm happy to talk. Your questions might be more in depth than there is time for here, but I'm happy to do
I
whatever
understand.
works for the group. So happy to sideline that, talk to you about the pro forma. I know that's a question everybody asks me. Our board, I assure you, was completely skeptical that my math worked, which is fair. That's your job anyway. But the pro forma shows it works. And so I'm happy to talk to you about the bundling of what that looks like. In terms of the HUD piece, so we have 400 units of permanent supportive housing. 300 of those are for adults for us, 100 are for families. So we're one of the larger family permanent supportive housing providers, is what they tell me. I think we're watching it closely. It is the first time I've ever felt pressure in the last year, and did bring on a federal team to help us make sure that the voices of the folks that we work with, right, and we're trying to keep housed and support are at those tables. What was said to me is you're either at the tables or your dinner right now. And so, we took the let's be at the table perspective. I think the way that we've approached it federally is from an evidence-based model perspective, in trying to show them where the evidence is for us for over 20 years, right? What works when we house people, it works, right? And so, as much as maybe there's traction to hear that, I suppose we've had a few conversations, so that's a better sign than only one and not having another. I think it seems the administration federally is pretty intent on reducing permanent supportive housing, and so I think many of us are scrambling to really figure out how do we help keep our folks housed, right? If we lost even 40%, which is what the revised numbers are, that 60% of the new bid will be for permanent supportive housing, 40% will be transitional. Sometimes what I'm saying to folks is like, we just got to get through the next year or two, right? And I don't know that we have the long-term game right now for that 40%. But how do we try to figure out if there are exit strategies? Otherwise, how do we kind of look at clinical profiles and figure out if there are backup resources, right? I think it's a pretty hard stretch to think most nonprofits, if any, could hold long-term subsidy on this with no help, right? It's just they're large numbers on our budgets. We right now fundraise 25% of that, but adding to 100% is a very different number. And so, our board, for example, has done scenario planning. How many months could we hold before it would shake the agency's core, right, for rents if they were all pulled out, right? Or if 50% were pulled out. I mean, those are definitely scenarios that we've looked at through our board. And I don't know if there are any good answers. I mean, I think those of you out in the world who help promote for us, who help reach out, I think the administration listens to certain demographics more than others. And I don't even mean that by political, I mean that by industry, right? There are certain industries that I think do carry more weight, right, than nonprofits, truthfully. I think there's a lot of worry that this administration has about what we do with our dollars in nonprofits. I make sometimes an obnoxious remark that our CEOs in nonprofits actually have less resource with which we have to do more. And so either we run the best businesses or we're in big trouble, right? That's the way I look at it. But I think it's a tough one, right? And we're all just trying to kind of be 2 steps ahead where we can.
If I could, I know there are probably other questions, but I'd add to it. I think, and Jonathan, I appreciate that as an issue, right? And I think the larger macro issue is it's not only housing first, which is a subsection of subsidized housing, but it's like the housing authorities themselves are also looking across the country at looking substantial cuts, which will literally put hundreds of thousands of people out onto the street. So Family Aid, particularly, like we're working with the Boston Housing Authority. We were the primary agency to move families using federal Section 8 vouchers during COVID. We had 600 families that got something called an EHV voucher. And so we're working with the city to kind of figure out what the alternatives are there, municipally funded options, right? Other strategies to help keep families in their housing. So I think Danielle is right. There's a lot of complexity here, but I think there's the housing first piece, and then there's the larger piece overall about federal supports for housing that we have to address on a lot of different fronts.
Thank you. I know there's no real answer. It's a hard problem, so I appreciate you guys and everybody else here who are at the forefront of doing. We have to win the midterms. That's the start of the answer, right?
Yeah, checks and balances are important in government at all levels. But the real end result will be, to Larry's point, if we don't have solutions, there are people, families and adults, who will end up back on the streets. There is just no way around that if we don't have a true comprehensive solution or shift from the administration and the approach.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, for that thoughtful question. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask our expert speakers? Yes, Katie, please go ahead.
I apologize, I'm not on screen, but I'm homesick. But I guess my question is, do either of your organizations target people who are traditionally not shelterable? So people who, because of the barriers involved, like mental health issues or addiction, like, is there any targeting that? I'm a social worker as well as somebody who's
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
board. So that's my question.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So Danielle, I'll start. I think this is part of like eligibility becomes a large issue as the state has created a higher bar. If you're reading the Globe, right, fewer people can get into family shelter because unlike adult populations where everyone's allowed in and can stay as long as they need, families, the eligibility criteria to get in is much higher. Income levels, other types of issues. And so there are a lot of strategies. Danielle's working some, we are. So that's our prevention program. Actually, while our shelter component has been busy, our prevention programs have grown by more than 53% over the last 16 months because those are families who are ineligible for shelter. And our addressing that is by not looking at the constraints of government, but going to philanthropy. So that's our largest program, 3,800 children and parents. And then we've also on the back end, there's a same thing, Katie, you can appreciate is that families have to move by state law now have to move out of shelter after 6 months. So we've opened a private shelter on the back end right next to our largest congregate setting so that families have a place to stay to continue their work with us over those 9 months that Danielle talked about to help, 9 to 11 months, they can stay with us where the government can't really intervene and we can do the necessary work on the ground with families. So I think there's like front end and back end work. While there's a lot of advocacy work, Danielle and I have worked together on some advocacy projects to kind of change those rules so that eligibility kind of flips back to what it was before the politics of immigration kind of got in the way. So I know in the middle, there's a lot of hard work by ourselves and our colleagues to work to try to change some of that policy.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, I think each agency's tried to step in and take different slices of the pie, truthfully, and that's actually been part of what some of us have talked about is like, okay, you take this piece and we're going to take this piece, right? What can your agency kind of naturally stand up quickly? And agencies often have different abilities to respond in different ways based on the foundation of the work. So, some of the work we ended up doing and have continued to do when needed is putting out street teams, right? We hear that there's a group of families that are sleeping in their cars. We hear that there are families in parks. I've actually gone with our teams because I like to see sometimes firsthand what's kind of going on, and we'll send folks out to try to see, can we find those families? Can we figure out why they're not in shelter? How to try to get them in the shelter. There are a group of families that aren't eligible based on being what we call over income, right? They make too much money. Hence the work we're talking about in the modular world, right? So that's where we're trying to kind of hit the two ends a little bit differently for our agency. I think the other thing that we pushed hard and we got some give on was kind of a winter overflow capacity for families. And so, for me, what I said is, look, as someone who comes out of child welfare and had child fatalities on my desk every day at DCF, my job is to make sure still here that no child dies at night, right? That is first and foremost what we have to think about in the work we do. And not that that's every day present in shelter the same way as child welfare, but it has moments, right? So it's winter. We just all lived through the storm for those of us in state. For those of you out of state, it was definitely a storm. And so, we worked to make sure there was access and that we had a place that a kid could be any night they needed to. And the state did kind of work to stand up sites with us across the state for that. So those are the wins where, Larry and myself and others go in and advocate. The administration, relative to administrations, will listen. Some administrations don't. These guys, we don't always get everything we want, but these are big ones for us, right? We want to know at night that kids had a place to go, and that we'll throw people out on our team on the streets, and let's go see where we're hearing folks on, right? And see if we can get them kind of looped in. I would say that's more complicated with the immigration pressures this year. So some of the families we know at this point who are out and not necessarily coming in are afraid of immigration issues. And it doesn't mean they're here illegally. So that is not what that statement means, but that they're afraid, right? We have staff who've immigrated here. We have staff, and I'm sure Larry does too, who are nervous, right? Who have different immigration statuses that have always been legal, right? And folks feel very vulnerable right now. So.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have a question? Well, while folks think about it, I would love to hear just a little bit. I know you guys work together sometimes, and I know you have a lot of overlap in the populations you serve and your approaches. Can you just like spell it out a little bit more for us about sort of where the handoff is between your organizations or how you guys sort of work together in this larger ecosystem?
I did notice, sorry, Rachel, I know it looked like Bill Hannigan looked like you took yourself off mute. I didn't know if you had a question. I didn't want to
Oh, you know what? Yeah,
jump over.
go for it. Bill, please come off mute.
I did, but I'd be interested to hear the answer to Rachel's question at the end. No, my observation leading to the question was that there are so many moving parts, and you guys are both working and chipping away at different parts of it, and have been for a long time. When we hear the trends in either the number or type of families or the government supports, all seems incredibly challenging. And so my question to you is, what are the opportunities that are coming out of this particular moment in the crisis, and what areas give you hope about future success in your part of this crisis?
Larry, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple things. I think first and foremost, I think there's a backstop to all this, right? I think there are a tremendous number of people, organizations coming forward to support families in a way that I have not seen in my 42-year career. So actually, I noticed Josephine McNeil, who's joined the call, who's a major community player in the community of Newton. She's on the call, I guess, as part of this group. She was, when we opened our large navigation center, she went out and said, I will help you build the partnerships necessary to strengthen the safety net, right? Just as a volunteer, just popped out of the woodwork. Like, I don't know you, but I'm going to come out and help. I think that's what gives me hope, right? I think the response from our partner agencies where we have these prioritized, MOU partnerships, same thing. We're willing to help, right? We understand this particular population. Danielle mentioned all the dynamics underneath it. They're same. She and I share that. Our work is parallel, conjoined, if you will, not necessarily handoff, but conjoined in so many ways. People just coming forward and being willing to help, and I think that's the hopefulness to this, right? Because I see good people coming forward to kind of fix that system. I think on pause is we do have other work. I've never spent more time on Beacon Hill than I have now, or with the federal government. I think that's part of it. But I do see that there are folks who are creating plans and working together across departments and across municipal and state government. So I'm encouraged to hear over my career. I've never heard the state and the city of Boston working so closely together on some of these issues. And those are the things that kind of give me some hope. I can see a lot of will relative to people's needs. So that's what keeps us going here. Plus, you see those kids every day, and nothing else but the kids themselves give you the most hope.
Yeah, so I'd add three things from kind of the way I think about it for hope. One, I think the shelter system is a younger system. So when we look at child welfare, mental health, right, those are older systems. And so what I've seen, albeit painful, and now 2.5 years in, is an attempt at system evolution, right? And so for me, that's important that over time systems don't stay stagnant. They kind of continually evolve and respond to changing times and needs. I don't think we're done yet, but I think that's what we've attempted to go through in real time. We truly have built the plane as we've flown it on this one. And it's been, there's definitely brutally painful days we have doing that as teams out here, but but I think everybody really leans into, and is determined, to Larry's point. I think too, the thing that we understand differently is often people have thought of shelter as just a big box. And I say that both literally and figuratively. And for me, what I've said to the city when we've kind of stood up overflows that look a little different than the way others have done it is I think about clinical profile. I think about the different needs that those of us who are therapists would think of when we're sitting with families or clients in our offices. And how do we think about building programmatic responses from a shelter model perspective that are more designed and tailored to certain groupings, right? And it lets us, I do believe, become more successful in our outcomes by doing that. It makes more folks willing to kind of come into services and come into shelter, right? Because they feel like it's a better fit and can help them. And so that is one thing I do think has come out of this. Like when I say to folks, you have a lot of single parents with kids with autism, that's not actually a data point that we knew a few years ago, truthfully. And that's a critical one, right? It's actually a big policy gap. And so those are the types of things to me that come out of these moments. I think for me, the other thing for our agency is it really pushed us to think creatively about how did a nonprofit like ours lean into affordable housing. So when I think about the groupings of families, which can be upwards of 50% of people who walk into shelter to try to get shelter a day, up to 50% can be declined due to over income. That's a different problem we had to solve for as well. And so the modular response for us is due to that problem. And so that's a folks that we don't see. They're doubled up, they're in their cars, right? We're hearing about that from chiefs of police. That grouping, I'm determined for our agency to get to, right? We don't see them in the shelter, right? Maybe they don't present as the highest risk that day, but that doesn't mean they're not high risk, right? And that they don't need a response. And so for me, it pushed creativity and a drive to figure out the math, Jonathan, to your question, on our pro forma that looks different because we've got to figure this out. And it isn't going to be, if it were easy, we would have figured it out. My board, you guys, right? We got a lot of smart people who've been working on this for years. It is true. My board says if we figure this out, we've cracked something a little bit differently, and that could help really contribute. But it did push creativity, right? So those are the silver linings in it, in the way that I think about it.
Thank you both. That was a great answer and a great question, Bill. So in our last couple of minutes, yeah, I'd love to hear just a little bit about how your guys' organization works together.
Well, usually Larry calls me and yells at me that I haven't done something he wants me to do. That's typically how those phone calls go in direction. Danielle, you're not at this meeting with us. Why are you not? No, I think we've worked together. Larry, you came in what, 7? You came in shortly after I started.
Yeah, we're within months of each other. The new CEO club. Yeah. So, yeah.
And Larry had come with far more experience in this industry, right? You came out of Pine Street and had more direct experience. I think it took, this system, to my point of evolving, is often nonprofits, to me, my experience was I could have moved to another state when I came over to the shelter system from child welfare. I didn't know the CEOs. I didn't know anybody in the room. I literally could have moved somewhere else, which threw me because we're such a small state. I've worked in nonprofit and government my whole career. One would think I knew people, but I didn't. And so Larry actually was one of the folks I met early on, and we kind of just talked about interest in work, and I come out of child welfare. Larry really likes kids too, and so how did we think about our work together?
Yeah. So I do think there's a little birds of a feather. So like procedurally, if you look at the continuum of services, there's kind of like homelessness prevention, diversion, shelter, housing, stabilization, housing. So it's a cycle, really, right? As families struggle with their poverty. And Danielle and our work, I'd say, like at the family aid is kind of way upstream with families who are just beginning to struggle. Danielle's kind of at that intersection where things are getting really bad. We both do the shelter work, slightly different, but in the same model, right? We, as Danielle does, we put a lot of emphasis in housing placement and prevention. So our work is all kind of similar in that zone. Family aid picks up with what's called rapid rehousing. Those of you in government know it's a form of work. That's what we do. And then Daniel's got the far back end, which is the permanent affordable housing. So when a family moves to that system, they land at Danielle's doorstep in her affordable housing, they stay forever, right? So we're kind of triaging up farther up the crisis place. I think we join there, but where we spend a lot of time, I would say, running into each other on advocacy issues where we're, going out to advocate. So for example, our two agencies plus St. Mary's Center, if you've ever spoken to them, a group of us, 5 of us went to the state and said, you cannot be kicking children and parents out of our shelters in the dead of winter. So I think that collective work, our board worked together, where we kind of changed that policy. Said, look, at least like you do with individuals, let them stay in until after the springtime, right? And then we'll work on the larger policy. So generally, I would say our collaboration is on really thinking about the kids from a lot of different perspectives that come out of youth development. And then looking at kind of this larger system issue where, again, a lot of folks have involved. Again, as you head into that work, please do take a look at bostonchime.org, where our organizations have worked together to kind of think about how to improve those systems. And that's where I think a lot of the agencies interact at this point, because we do parallel kind of work. So hopefully that's helpful overview.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. Okay, for all of you funders in the room, this is your, I'm not going to say last chance, but this is one more chance for you to ask any questions of our experts while we have them. And
What
if
was the website you just mentioned? bostonsomething.org?
Sure. Yep. It's www.bostonchime, CHIME.org. CHIME stands for Child Homelessness Engagement and Improvement of Systems. So it's a site that has about 200 organizations that have kind of created reports on where things have to improve. And actually, the outcome of it was policy changes and actual 25 additional partnerships, plus kind of collaborative training for not only the homeless system, but all the corollary systems that Danielle talked about. So training and work with educational systems, medical systems. So you can see kind of all that work that was funded by Aspen, and Dana-Farber has now kind of come to a close, and the United Way is picking it up to kind of keep the effort underway. But you can see kind of thought process on it.
Okay, and I saw that Skylar put the link in the chat, and we can also include it when we send out the recording for this meeting. Phil, I see you're off mute. Did you want to add anything or have a question?
This is just a very basic question, but say I'm a funder who doesn't really know much about anything. Does this sound familiar? But I have strong opinions, and I come to you and I say there's a Maslow's pyramid for family happiness. And at the very bottom of this, before you can do anything, you have to have housing and shelter in place. Would you agree with that? I'm hearing a very nuanced conversation where everything is interrelated, but would you subscribe to this theory that the base of all family happiness is housing?
I would add food to that. Housing, right? Housing and food to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree. And I think the challenge, Philip, is the sustaining it requires a lot of these other systems to come into play. So that's like we work at the intersection of where that work happens. So part of like the housing first, I know, Jonathan, you mentioned this, right? It's like, don't worry about the problems, put people into housing first. I subscribe to that. In our case, it's often shelter or something else, right? I think the reality, though, is that housing bucket is so tight, and Danielle's coming with some innovations. We've done some other innovations to keep people in their housing. That's fundamental. But then we can't lose sight of everything else a parent or a child need to be successful in life, right? It's just not the roof over their heads. It's all the great supports to help kind of lift them up. Because what we found is when the state worries right now, they're using this thing called home base. So here's your bucket of money, but parents still haven't dealt with all the other challenges. They haven't had may not have the support to do it. They get it from our two agencies, but not always. And so that just pushes people right back. It's called recidivism. So we've got to think about that because it's a better cost and it's a reduction of trauma for the kids. So I think yes, and it's a yes and answer, I would say.
Yes.
So.
Can I just say, I know we're coming to the end, and I don't want to take too much time, but what impresses me is someone who's worked in related fields for a long time is the incredible sophistication of the work that's being done by both of your agencies and thinking through the problems and all the pieces of it. It's not just let's open up a shelter and get people into it and off the street. That's really, really important. But the detailed thought and programmatic sophistication of what you're doing to both keep people where they are so they don't get onto the street, and then once you put them someplace, to keep them there so they don't go back on the street. That's just huge. And that's really impressive in the systems that both of your organizations have set up and are working on. So I'm someone who comes to this, a little bit from the inside, but now mostly from the outside. I have to say I'm just really impressed by that level of work. So I really appreciate everything you've shared with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Jonathan pretty much took the words out of my mouth, but thank you so much again to Danielle and Larry and your teams. We really enjoyed hearing from you. And funders, we can stay on for just a little bit longer and have a bit of a discussion, and we'll keep
Thanks
things
again,
moving along.
everybody. Great to meet folks.
Great.